The folders on Ted Cruz's desk contained more than just economic data. They contained the complete destruction of AOC's socialist fantasy. As the young congresswoman prepared to defend her Green New Deal in front of the Senate committee, she had no idea that Cruz possessed cost analyses, job impact studies, and energy projections that would make her proposals look like economic suicide. What was about to unfold would be the most systematic takedown of socialist policy in American political history. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of the explosive political drama we cover. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when decades of economic expertise collide with socialist wishful thinking in the most devastating way possible. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. This was the moment when economic reality met political fantasy, when free market principles confronted socialist ideology, and when one of America's sharpest legal minds was about to expose the fundamental flaws in the progressive movement's most ambitious proposal. The Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works had been planning this hearing on climate policy for months. Officially titled, Examining the Economic Costs and Benefits of Climate Proposals, the hearing was designed to provide a forum for discussing various approaches to environmental policy. What it was about to become was a masterclass in how economic data could destroy political narratives. Senator Ted Cruz, now 54 and serving his third term representing Texas, had spent his entire political career mastering the art of policy debate. A Harvard Law School graduate who had argued cases before the Supreme Court, Cruz possessed one of the sharpest legal minds in the Senate. But more than his legal expertise, Cruz had developed a deep understanding of economic policy that made him one of the most formidable opponents of progressive spending proposals. Cruz's preparation for this hearing had been meticulous. For months, his staff had been working with economists, energy experts, and policy analysts to build a comprehensive case against the Green New Deal. They had commissioned independent studies, analyzed cost projections, and gathered data from economists across the political spectrum. What they had assembled was not just a critique of AOC's proposals, but a systematic demolition of the economic assumptions underlying the entire progressive climate agenda. The senator's strategy was simple but devastating. He would use AOC's own numbers against her, showing that even the most optimistic projections for the Green New Deal would result in economic catastrophe. He had prepared charts, graphs, and analyses that would make her proposals look not just expensive, but economically impossible. Across the witness table sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the 35-year-old congresswoman from New York's 14th District who had become the most recognizable face of progressive politics in America. Since her stunning upset victory in 2018, AOC had transformed from an unknown bartender to one of the most influential voices in the Democratic Party. Her Green New Deal had become the cornerstone of progressive environmental policy, inspiring millions of young Americans and reshaping the Democratic Party's approach to climate change. But AOC's rise had also made her a target for conservative criticism. Her background in economics. She had graduated cum laude from Boston University with a degree in economics and international relations, was frequently dismissed by her critics as insufficient preparation for the sweeping policy proposal she advocated. Tonight's hearing would test whether her economic understanding could withstand serious scrutiny from one of the Senate's most skilled debaters. AOC had agreed to testify before the committee as part of her ongoing effort to build support for climate action. She had spent weeks preparing talking points about job creation, economic transformation, and the costs of climate inaction. Her strategy was to portray the Green New Deal not as an economic burden, but as an economic opportunity that would create millions of jobs while addressing the climate crisis. What AOC didn't know was that Cruz had been studying her proposals with the intensity of a prosecutor building a case. He had identified specific weaknesses in her economic arguments, contradictions in her cost estimates, and flaws in her job creation projections. The folders on his desk contained ammunition that would systematically destroy every major claim she had made about the economic benefits of her climate proposals. The Hart Senate office building was packed beyond capacity as the hearing began. Environmental activists filled the gallery, alongside conservative policy advocates and energy industry representatives. The media presence was unprecedented for a committee hearing, with major networks preparing to broadcast what many expected would be a defining moment in the climate policy debate. Committee Chairman Senator Shelley Moore Capito opened the hearing with remarks about the importance of evidence-based policy making and the need for serious economic analysis of climate proposals. The ranking Democratic member, Senator Tom Carper, countered with statements about the urgency of climate action and the economic opportunities created by clean energy investments. But everyone in the room knew that the real drama would come when Cruz and AOC faced off directly. The Texas conservative and the New York progressive represented two completely different visions of America's economic future, and their confrontation would crystallize the fundamental debate about the role of government in addressing climate change. When AOC was called to testify, she approached the witness table with the confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. She wore a professional navy blazer and carried herself with the poise that had made her such an effective spokesperson for progressive causes. Her opening statement was polished and passionate, hitting all the talking points that had made the Green New Deal popular with young voters. Thank you, Chairman Capito, for this opportunity to discuss one of the most important challenges facing our nation. AOC began, her voice carrying the conviction that had made her social media star. Climate change is not just an environmental crisis. It's an economic crisis that threatens the livelihoods of millions of Americans. She gestured toward the audience, which included many young environmental activists. But it's also an economic opportunity. The Green New Deal represents the largest job creation program in American history. It will create millions of good-paying union jobs while building the clean energy infrastructure our nation needs to compete in the 21st century. AOC's presentation was confident and well-rehearsed, emphasizing themes of economic opportunity and job creation rather than focusing primarily on environmental benefits. Conservative critics like to focus on the costs of climate action, but they ignore the costs of climate inaction. Every year, we delay meaningful climate policy, we face more expensive extreme weather events, more agricultural losses, and more economic disruption. She pulled out her own set of prepared materials. According to independent economic analysis, the Green New Deal will create 20 million jobs over the next decade. These aren't just any jobs. They're high-quality manufacturing jobs, construction jobs, and technical jobs that will rebuild America's middle class. The presentation continued for 20 minutes, with AOC systematically making the case for her climate proposals as economic policy rather than just environmental policy. Her argument was sophisticated and well-delivered, emphasizing job creation, economic transformation, and the competitive advantages of clean energy leadership. But Ted Cruz had been taking notes throughout her presentation, and his expression suggested that he found her economic projections questionable at best. When it came time for senators to question the witness, Cruz was ready to strike. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, he began, his voice carrying the precise tone of a prosecutor beginning a cross-examination. Thank you for your testimony today. I want to focus on some of the specific economic claims you've made about the Green New Deal. AOC straightened in her chair, clearly prepared for hostile questioning from the Texas senator. You mentioned that the Green New Deal will create 20 million jobs over the next decade. That's a very specific number. Can you tell us where that projection comes from? Senator Cruz, that number comes from independent economic modeling conducted by leading economists and energy analysts. AOC replied confidently. It's based on the job creation potential of massive infrastructure investment and clean energy deployment. Cruz nodded, as if he had been expecting exactly that answer. Independent economic modeling. That's interesting, because I've been reviewing the economic analyses of the Green New Deal, and I've found some very different projections. He opened the first folder on his desk, revealing charts and graphs that were clearly visible to the cameras. This is an analysis conducted by the American Enterprise Institute, examining the job creation claims of the Green New Deal. According to their modeling, Your proposal would actually result in a net loss of 5.2 million jobs over the first decade. The number hit the hearing room like a bomb. AOC's confident expression flickered slightly as she realized that Cruz had come prepared with competing economic data. Furthermore, Cruz continued, "This analysis from the Heritage Foundation projects that the Green New Deal would reduce GDP by $15 trillion over the next decade and increase energy costs for the average American household by $3,900 per year." He held up the documents so the cameras could capture them clearly. "So I have to ask, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, which economist should we believe? Your unnamed independent analysts who project massive job creation, or these detailed studies that project economic catastrophe?" AOC tried to respond, but Cruz wasn't finished with his methodical demolition of her economic arguments. "Let me be more specific about the job creation claims," he continued, opening a second folder. "You say the Green New Deal will create 20 million jobs. But according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are currently only 2.7 million people employed in all renewable energy sectors combined." The mathematical impossibility was becoming clear. "So you're essentially claiming that your proposal will create 7 times more jobs than currently exist in the entire renewable energy industry. Does that sound economically realistic to you?" AOC tried to interrupt, but Cruz held up his hand. "I'm not finished, Congresswoman, because the job creation numbers are just the beginning of the economic problems with your proposal." He opened a third folder, this one containing what appeared to be detailed cost breakdowns. "Let's talk about the actual costs of the Green New Deal. You mentioned that critics focus too much on costs, but I think the American people deserve to know exactly what they're being asked to pay for." Cruz held up a document bearing official government letterheads. "This is a cost analysis conducted by the Congressional Budget Office, your own Congressional Budget Office, estimating the fiscal impact of Green New Deal proposals. Their projections show total costs of between $51 trillion and $93 trillion over the next decade." The numbers were staggering, and even some Democratic committee members looked surprised by the scale. To put that in perspective, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, the entire federal budget for 2024 was $6.2 trillion. You're proposing to spend between 8 and 15 times the entire federal budget on climate programs alone. Cruz's presentation was methodical and devastating, using official government data to make AOC's proposals look economically impossible. But let's break that down further, because I think the American people deserve to understand what this means for their families. He opened another folder, this one containing household-level projections. According to these Treasury Department calculations, funding the Green New Deal would require increasing federal taxes by an average of $65,000 per household per year. That's more than the median household income in America. The implications were staggering. Cruz was showing that AOC's proposals would require tax increases larger than most people's entire salaries. So, I have to ask again, Congresswoman, do you really think it's economically realistic to ask American families to pay $65,000 per year in additional taxes to fund your climate proposals? AOC finally found her voice to respond. "Senator Cruz, those cost estimates are wildly inflated and don't account for the economic benefits of climate action or the costs of climate inaction. Independent economists have shown that the Green New Deal will more than pay for itself through job creation and economic growth." But Cruz had been waiting for exactly this response. "Independent economists again," he said, his tone suggesting skepticism. "Let me share what some actual independent economists have said about your proposals." He opened yet another folder, this one containing what appeared to be academic studies. This is a peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, examining the macroeconomic impacts of large-scale climate spending. The authors, who include economists from Harvard, MIT, and Stanford, conclude that the level of spending proposed in the Green New Deal would result in, and I quote, "severe macroeconomic instability, unsustainable debt accumulation, and significant crowding out of private investment." The academic credibility of the criticism was damaging to AOC's claims about economic consensus. Furthermore, Cruz continued. This study from the National Bureau of Economic Research finds that rapid transitions away from fossil fuels of the type you propose typically result in what economists call stranded assets. Basically, economic destruction in traditional energy communities. He looked directly at AOC. The study estimates that your proposals would eliminate 4.6 million jobs in traditional energy sectors, including oil, gas, coal, and petrochemicals. These are high-paying, blue-collar jobs in states like Texas, Louisiana, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Cruz was systematically demonstrating that AOC's job creation projections ignored the job destruction that would result from her policies. So, when you claim that the Green New Deal will create 20 million jobs, you're not mentioning that it will simultaneously destroy nearly 5 million existing jobs. That's not job creation. That's economic disruption on a massive scale. The senator was building toward what would become the most devastating part of his presentation. But let me address what I think is the fundamental flaw in your economic thinking. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, you seem to believe that government spending automatically creates economic value. But that's not how economics works. Cruz opened his largest folder, revealing comprehensive economic analyses. This is a study from the Congressional Research Service examining the economic multiplier effects of different types of government spending. What they found is that infrastructure spending, the kind you're proposing, has one of the lowest economic multipliers of any form of government investment. He held up charts showing comparative economic impacts. Every dollar spent on Green New Deal infrastructure generates approximately 73 cents in economic activity. In other words, your proposal actually destroys economic value rather than creating it. The mathematical reality was stark. AOC was proposing to spend trillions of dollars on programs that would make the economy smaller, not larger. Compare that to tax cuts, which generate $1.32 in economic activity for every dollar of reduced government revenue, or to private sector investment, which generates $2.15 in economic activity for every dollar invested. Cruz was demonstrating that virtually any alternative use of the money would be more economically productive than AOC's climate spending. So not only would the Green New Deal cost $93 trillion, not only would it require $65,000 per household in additional taxes, not only would it destroy millions of existing jobs, it would actually make the American economy smaller and less productive. The systematic destruction of AOC's economic arguments was complete, but Cruz had saved his most devastating critique for last. There's one more aspect of your proposal that I think demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how energy economics work, he said, opening a final folder containing technical energy analyses. But let me address what I think is the fundamental flaw in your economic thinking. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, you seem to believe that government spending automatically creates economic value. But that's not how economics works. Cruz opened his largest folder, revealing comprehensive economic analyses. This is a study from the Congressional Research Service examining the economic multiplier effects of different types of government spending. What they found is that infrastructure spending, the kind you're proposing, has one of the lowest economic multipliers of any form of government investment. He held up charts showing comparative economic impacts. Every dollar spent on Green New Deal infrastructure generates approximately 73 cents in economic activity. In other words, your proposal actually destroys economic value rather than creating it. The mathematical reality was stark. AOC was proposing to spend trillions of dollars on programs that would make the economy smaller, not larger. Compare that to tax cuts, which generate $1.32 in economic activity for every dollar of reduced government revenue, or to private sector investment, which generates $2.15 in economic activity for every dollar invested. Cruz was demonstrating that virtually any alternative use of the money would be more economically productive than AOC's climate spending. So not only would the Green New Deal cost $93 trillion, not only would it require $65,000 per household in additional taxes, not only would it destroy millions of existing jobs, it would actually make the American economy smaller and less productive. The systematic destruction of AOC's economic arguments was complete, but Cruz had saved his most devastating critique for last. There's one more aspect of your proposal that I think demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how energy economics work, he said, opening a final folder containing technical energy analyses. You propose to eliminate fossil fuel use and transition entirely to renewable energy within 10 years. Let me explain why that's not just economically impossible, but physically impossible. Cruz held up what appeared to be engineering studies and grid reliability analyses. According to the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, wind and solar power currently provide about 12% of America's electricity generation. To scale that up to 100% would require building approximately 3,000 gigawatts of new renewable capacity. The technical specificity of his argument was overwhelming. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to building 3,000 nuclear power plants or 1.2 million wind turbines, or covering an area the size of South Carolina entirely in solar panels. And all of this would need to be completed in 10 years. Cruz was showing that AOC's timeline was not just economically unrealistic, but technically impossible. The raw materials alone for this transition would require mining more copper, lithium, and rare earth elements than have been mined in all of human history combined. The environmental impact of that mining would be catastrophic. He held up environmental impact studies. Furthermore, renewable energy sources are intermittent and unreliable. Wind doesn't blow consistently, and the sun doesn't shine at night. To provide reliable power, you would need massive battery storage systems that don't currently exist at the scale required. Cruz was systematically demolishing not just the economic assumptions of the Green New Deal, but its technical feasibility. The battery storage alone would require mining 40 million tons of lithium, approximately 2,000 times current global annual production. At current mining rates, it would take 2,000 years to produce the lithium needed for your energy transition. The mathematical impossibility was undeniable. So let me summarize what we've learned about the Green New Deal today. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, Cruz said, gathering his folders as if presenting a closing argument. It would cost between $51 trillion and $93 trillion, requiring tax increases of $65,000 per household per year. It would destroy 4.6 million existing jobs while creating far fewer new ones. It would reduce economic productivity and make America poorer. And it's technically impossible to implement within the timeline you propose. Cruz looked directly at AOC, who had been trying unsuccessfully to interrupt his presentation. You call this an economic opportunity. I call it economic suicide. The hearing room erupted in chaos, with environmental activists shouting objections and conservative audience members applauding Cruz's systematic demolition of the Green New Deal. But Cruz wasn't finished. He had one final point that would complete his destruction of AOC's credibility. There's one more thing, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. You mentioned your economics degree from Boston University. I'm curious, did your economics professors teach you about opportunity cost? AOC tried to respond, but Cruz continued. Opportunity cost is the economic principle that every dollar spent on one thing is a dollar that can't be spent on something else. If we spend $93 trillion on the Green New Deal, that's $93 trillion that can't be spent on healthcare, education, infrastructure, or debt reduction. He opened one final document. According to this Treasury analysis, $93 trillion could eliminate poverty in America, provide universal health care, rebuild every bridge and highway in the country, and still have $20 trillion left over. The comparison was devastating. AOC was proposing to spend enough money to solve virtually every other problem in America on a climate program that would make the economy worse. So my final question is this. Given that your proposal would destroy jobs, increase taxes, reduce economic productivity, and consume resources that could address every other major challenge facing America, why should any rational person support the Green New Deal? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Cruz had just delivered the most systematic and devastating critique of progressive climate policy in congressional history. AOC tried to respond, arguing that Cruz's cost estimates were inflated and that he was ignoring the benefits of climate action. But her responses sounded weak and defensive after Cruz's comprehensive presentation. Senator Cruz, these worst-case scenario projections don't represent the consensus of climate economists, she said, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. Multiple studies have shown that climate action will create jobs and economic opportunities. Which studies? Cruz asked immediately. Can you cite specific economic analyses that support your job creation numbers? AOC hesitated, clearly unprepared for such specific questioning. The Green New Deal has been endorsed by hundreds of economists who understand that climate action is an economic necessity, she replied, but she couldn't provide specific citations. Hundreds of economists, Cruz repeated, his tone suggesting skepticism. Congresswoman, I presented peer-reviewed studies from Harvard, MIT, Stanford, the Congressional Budget Office, the Treasury Department, and the Congressional Research Service. These aren't partisan organizations. They're the most credible economic institutions in America. He gestured to his stack of folders. You've mentioned independent economists and multiple studies and hundreds of economists, but you haven't cited a single specific analysis. Don't you think the American people deserve more than vague references to unnamed experts? The contrast was stark. Cruz had presented detailed, specific, documented economic analyses, while AOC was relying on general claims about expert consensus. As the hearing concluded, it was clear that Cruz had delivered one of the most effective takedowns of progressive policy in recent memory. His systematic use of economic data had made AOC's proposals look not just expensive, but economically illiterate. The aftermath was immediate and devastating for the progressive climate movement. Clips of Cruz's presentation were shared millions of times across social media, with conservatives celebrating his use of economic data to demolish socialist policy proposals. Major economic publications began examining the data Cruz had presented, and most found his analyses to be accurate and well-sourced. The Wall Street Journal called it the most effective use of economic analysis in congressional testimony in recent memory. Even some liberal economists began expressing concerns about the feasibility of the Green New Deal's timeline and cost projections. Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and progressive commentator, wrote that while he supported climate action, Senator Cruz raised legitimate questions about the economic modeling underlying some progressive climate proposals. For AOC, the hearing represented a significant setback in her efforts to build mainstream support for the Green New Deal. Her inability to respond effectively to Cruz's economic arguments had exposed weaknesses in the intellectual foundation of her signature policy proposal. Conservative media celebrated Cruz's performance as a vindication of free market economics over socialist central planning. Fox News ran segments praising his data-driven demolition of progressive climate policy, while conservative think tanks began producing detailed analyses building on his economic arguments. More significantly, the hearing had shifted the terms of the climate policy debate. Instead of focusing primarily on environmental benefits, discussions now centered on economic costs and feasibility. Cruz had forced progressives to defend their proposals on economic grounds, where they were much more vulnerable to criticism. The confrontation also highlighted the importance of economic expertise in policy debates. Cruz's background in law and economics had allowed him to present complex financial analyses in accessible terms, while AOC's economics degree had not prepared her for the level of detailed questioning she faced. Political analysts noted that the hearing represented a broader challenge for the progressive movement. How to maintain popular support for ambitious social programs when those programs faced serious economic scrutiny. The Green New Deal had been popular when presented as a visionary response to climate change, but it became much more controversial when analyzed as a specific economic proposal. For Cruz, the hearing represented the culmination of years of preparation and strategic thinking about how to counter progressive policy proposals. His systematic use of economic data had provided a template for conservative opposition to liberal spending programs that went far beyond traditional ideological arguments. The long-term implications of the hearing were significant for American climate policy. While environmental concerns remained important to many Americans, Cruz had succeeded in framing climate action as an economic burden rather than an economic opportunity. This framing would influence climate policy debates for years to come. Perhaps most importantly, the confrontation had demonstrated the power of economic analysis to shape political debates. Cruz's use of detailed cost projections, job impact studies, and technical feasibility analyses had proven more effective than traditional political attacks in undermining progressive policy proposals. The hearing also revealed the importance of preparation and expertise in high-stakes political confrontations. Cruz had spent months gathering economic data and developing his arguments, while AOC appeared to have relied primarily on talking points and general policy principles. As the dust settled from the hearing, it became clear that the progressive movement would need to develop more sophisticated economic arguments if it hoped to maintain credibility in policy debates. The era of promoting major spending programs based primarily on good intentions and aspirational goals was over. The confrontation between Ted Cruz and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became more than just a congressional hearing. It became a template for how economic analysis could be used to evaluate and critique ambitious policy proposals, regardless of their political popularity or moral appeal. In the end, Cruz had achieved something remarkable. He had used economic data to transform a debate about climate policy into a debate about economic reality. And in that debate, reality had won decisively over fantasy. The lesson was clear. In American politics, good intentions were not enough. Policy proposals needed to be economically sound, technically feasible, and financially responsible. And sometimes it took a senator with a stack of economic studies to remind everyone of that fundamental truth. AOC's socialist dreams hadn't just been challenged. They had been systematically dismantled by the cold, hard mathematics of economic reality. And in the world of policy making, mathematics always had the last word.